I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again for JOBLO.com with another video edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the 1994 Martin Campbell film No Escape, starring Ray Liotta, Lance Henriksen, Stuart Wilson, Dillon and Ernie Hudson, with an awesome score by Graham Mervell. Now, this one takes place in a dystopian future where a soldier named Robbins, played by Ray Liotta, murders his commanding officer and is sent to a nightmarish penal colony called Absalom, an island ruled by cannibals. They are led by the charismatic and sadistic Merrick. Escaping his captors, he falls in with a society of non-violent ex-prisoners led by the father, played by Lance Henriksen, who preaches redemption. But for Robbins, the only thing that matters is escape. Now, I'd say that No Escape is an obscure but very important film. It's particularly important because it was the movie that landed Martin Campbell Goldeneye, and that's the movie which reignited the James Bond franchise after it almost petered out in the late 80s, and Campbell managed to do it again for Daniel Craig in 2006's Casino Royale. Whenever they need to launch a new Bond, it seems like Martin Campbell's their go-to guy. It might be a bit of a stretch, but in some ways, if it wasn't for No Escape, the Bond series may not have made it outside of the 90s. Of course, this isn't an article about James Bond, but rather about a film that's so obscure, the Weinstein Company poached the title for their own Wilson star of the same name, a film which coincidentally co-starred Pierce Brosnan. It's so obscure that it's not even out on Blu-ray, and you can't get it digitally. The only print of the movie available is an obscure DVD that's out of print from HBO that's non-anamorphic and a pretty piss-poor transfer to boot. Nevertheless, it's come out in some other regions outside of North America. Now, this one had quite the pedigree. It's produced by Gale Ann Hurd post-Terminator 2, and it was one of the few movies put out by a studio named Savoy Pictures. This company was briefly prominent in the mid-90s, but most of the movies were pretty disastrous. In fact, I'd say the only Savoy Pictures film that people really remember is A Bronx Tale, directed by and starring Robert De Niro. They initially made quite a bit of noise in the business because they tried to launch as a major studio, to the tune that they paid Sylvester Stallone a whopping $20 million to star in a film that ultimately never got made, and they changed the idea of what superstars should be paid, leading to tons of $20 million paydays in the late 90s, something which backfired badly when their movies didn't perform, such as what happened to Sylvester Stallone for a period after Assassins and Judge Dredd and The Specialist all came out and didn't do the business that people were expecting. So Savoy's lineup was notoriously poor. Even though they could afford to pay Sylvester Stallone $20 million, the rest of their movies, I don't know who was picking these films and thought they were a good idea, but it boggles the mind. I mean, one of the big movies that they did was called Exit to Eden, which is an erotic thriller set in an island resort that's into B&D and S&M and B&S. And for some reason, it's directed by Gary Marshall. You know, Gary Marshall from Pretty Woman and everybody's favorite grandfather in a bunch of movies. And it stars Rosie O'Donnell and Dan Aykroyd in an erotic thriller. I mean, Dana Delaney looks pretty hot in it, but that's about it. Exit to Eden was a notorious flop, so bad that on the Rosie O'Donnell show, Rosie O'Donnell used to make fun of it constantly, even doing an impression of Gary Marshall admitting, "Rosie, we did a bad job, it's not a good movie." And then they did another movie called Destiny Turns on the Radio, which I think was an attempt to launch Quentin Tarantino as a leading man. It didn't really work. So No Escape, which boasted a $20 million budget, not bad for the 90s, was their attempt to break into genre, and somehow they managed to land Ray Liotta, who was actually at a career high around this point, coming off of Goodfellas and Unlawful Entry. And he got the lead, which gave him a chance to finally shed the bad guy image he was famous for. They actually managed to open this film at #1 for the weekend, but No Escape sadly wasn't able to sustain any kind of box office momentum, and in the end only eked out about $15 million in the box office. Probably not a disastrous amount because I think it probably did okay overseas, although foreign numbers really haven't been released, and I'm assuming that it probably broke even on video and cable. I know it aired on cable a lot. Now, No Escape was a bit of a cult video in the mid-90s thanks to the futuristic premise and the hardcore action quotient. As a 12-year-old, I remember being blown away by how unapologetically brutal it was, and I have to say, at 38, I think it still holds up as a pretty solid actioner. albeit one that's kinda cheesy in certain respects. For one thing, No Escape is another one of those movies that totally screwed up their pessimistic vision of the future, imagining 2022 as some kind of hellish post-apocalyptic future where prisoners are sent to remote islands to be hunted by cannibals. Also, I have to say the VFX in the early scenes, which are set in a futuristic prison, don't really hold up, paling next to a much cheaper, similarly themed action film of the era called Fortress with Christophe Lambert that I actually wrote a column about some months back. However, once they leave the futuristic prison and go to the island prison, the movie becomes something of a variation on Most Dangerous Game, where Ray Liotta has to survive on the island, and boy oh boy does No Escape pick up big time, thanks mostly to some well-staged action and a top-notch cast. Even back then, Martin Campbell had a flair for carnage, and the numerous chase scenes and fights are good enough that one could really see why Eon snapped him up for Goldeneye. It helps that Liotta makes for a credible anti-hero, with his intensity giving the character an unpredictable streak, and the decision to only reveal his motivations for killing his commanding officer later in the film is a good one, because for much of it we really don't know if we're supposed to be rooting for him or not. A daring move in an action flick. For the first hour of the movie, kind of part of me as a kid thought he was actually the bad guy, and that somehow one of the other prisoners, maybe Ernie Hudson or Lance Henriksen, was going to emerge as the hero of the film. Liotta seems like he's kind of out of control and violent. Of course, it does emerge that he's a hero later on in the film, and I think that Ray Liotta plays this duplicity pretty well. Too bad then that his career as an action lead didn't really take off. It seems that people still prefer him as a scumbag for some reason. He's got this edge to him, I guess, that doesn't make for a heroic type character very well, but I think he actually is really well cast, even if he's totally cast against type. The supporting cast is also really good, with Lance Henriksen ideal as the peace-loving father, quote unquote, while Ernie Hudson is his tough but loyal second in command. Ernie Hudson was all over action movies like this in the mid-90s, and I love him. He was the coolest guy ever. The real scene stealer here, though, is Stuart Wilson. Now, Stuart Wilson was just coming off of Lethal Weapon 3, where he was the villain. I'm gonna eat your fucking heart! He was pretty good in Lethal Weapon 3, but he's absolutely on fire here in such an atypical role for a middle-aged English guy. I mean, he plays this guy named Merrick, the head of a cannibal tribe who's got these dreadlocks, and we also sense would rather Ray Liotta just join his gang and be his pal, as he's the only one to actually show any smarts. Seems that that's what he wants. He just wants a friend.
Listen, you gotta go, sweetheart. I'm not gonna stand in your way. I could probably use the
I'll
exercise.
stay.
And that makes him kind of sympathetic, even though he's doing crazy things like decapitating people. He's funny, he's unpredictable, and had No Escape been more widely seen, I think Wilson would have totally been established as a premier baddie, although Campbell himself probably understood that Wilson was great and reused him to pretty strong effect a couple of years later in The Mask of Zorro. The score by Graham Revell also deserves praise, with it one of his first big assignments, and helped establish him as one of the go-to genre composers of the late 90s and early 2000s. It's a really, really strong score right from the get-go, and I really like the whole No Escape theme that they play. That kind of, it's a motif that comes back and forth in the movie. Now, there are a lot of really good scenes. One of the things that really makes the movie work is the weird gallows humor that they have. And this is a great scene. So Ray Liotta gets dropped on the island and is immediately picked up by Wilson's gang, who are assuming he's going to be a pushover like all the other prisoners that they sent to him, and they try to make him take on a hulking member of their tribe in hand-to-hand combat. Now, the idea is that this guy is just going to dominate him and destroy him, and he's going to be meat that they can eat. Liotta is a genius in this scene. So the guy is about twice Ray Liotta's size. It looks like he could crush Ray Liotta like an ant, and Ray Liotta was never really a hulking action star. He looked like a normal guy. But what's cool about his character in the film is that he's smart. So they give him this little piece of wood, a spike, to fight this guy with a hammer, and rather than take him on in hand-to-hand combat, he just uses it as a spear and impales him, and boom, he's dead. The way that he deals with this threat and just completely knocks the guy out of the fight, and Wilson's reaction, is a priceless action moment and one of the best scenes Campbell ever directed. I mean, I kind of think that this is the scene which got him Goldeneye. Now, if you want to see No Escape, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. No Escape's home video rights have always been tied up in a strange position. They used to belong to HBO, that's right, the TV service HBO, who seemingly lost interest in all the theatrical movies in their catalog because in the 80s, HBO actually used to produce films. It was a way of helping guarantee that they had enough product to air on their TV stations. Now, these weren't made for cable movies, these were actually full-on films. There were movies like Flashpoint and a couple others that came out that were produced by HBO, including Ricochet starring Denzel Washington, another movie that I did for Best Movie You Never Saw. And unfortunately, as these movies kind of languished and became more obscure, HBO seemingly lost any interest in using them. The Hitcher was a similar thing, although I believe The Hitcher has been picked up by a distributor. Unfortunately, No Escape hasn't been picked up by anybody yet. The only one of their movies that actually did get picked up was A Bronx Tale, which has gotten a good release. So the only way you can kind of find this movie is in a bare bones DVD release from the late 90s, which is not anamorphic, and I believe is out of print, although you could probably still find some cheap copies of it on Amazon. However, it's really not a good transfer at all. So if you want to see this movie, I kind of recommend looking places for it because it's not that hard to find. It's, how you might say, available? So my parting shot is that No Escape is probably the most obscure movie I've written up for this column just because it's so damn hard to find. The tricky rights issues make it difficult to track down, but at least if you want to see a well-presented version of this film. If you don't mind looking at a crappy version of this film, I think you could still get the Snapper Case DVD pretty cheaply. That said, the effort that it takes to track down No Escape, from my point of view, is well worth it, especially if you're a hardcore action movie junkie for that era. It's really a cool 90s action flick, and one that I think a lot of people haven't seen. It'd be really cool if a company like Shout Factory, especially through Scream Factory, was to give this one a good HD upgrade. So, try to find it if you can. I really think it's a great movie, and well, I love this one, and it really is the best movie you've never seen. For JOBLO.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.